The modern conception of Rome is one of flawless marble columns and impenetrable legions, but the reality of its survival began here, as a rough, primitive settlement struggling against the mud of the Tiber River. Roman culture eventually built a powerful identity around the legend of its founding. They trace their origins to 753 BC, telling the story of abandoned twin brothers, Romulus and Remus, kept alive in the wilderness by a she-wolf. The practical history is less romantic. Early Romans survived because of geometry and geography. They built their settlement close enough to the sea to access maritime trade routes, but far enough inland to avoid frequent pirate raids. The local soil was rich, and the Tiber provided a constant water supply. Rome did not rise because of divine destiny. It grew from a collection of villages into a prosperous city through a strict adherence to agricultural utility and calculated trade. For its earliest decades, Rome was governed by kings. But absolute monarchy proved fragile. In 509 BC, the citizens forcibly removed their final king from the throne. This diagram shows the system they built to replace him. Rather than trusting a single ruler, they decentralized authority. Power was strictly divided among elected officials and a governing senate, forming one of history's earliest functional republics. The immediate result of this revolution was extreme danger. Stripping away the monarchy alienated local allies, and the nascent republic quickly found itself surrounded by hostile tribal forces across the Italian peninsula. The Roman Republic was born under siege. Its complex political system was forged out of an urgent, desperate need to coordinate a defense against external annihilation. Securing their borders meant the Romans could never stop fighting. Decades of continuous military mobilization became a requirement for survival. Through disciplined tactical innovation and a network of strategic alliances, Rome pushed outward. They systematically absorbed hostile city-states, converting former enemies into buffer zones. By taking control of the entire Italian peninsula, they achieved total regional security. But extending their borders outward eliminated their geographic isolation. Pushing south placed Rome in direct contact with Carthage. Operating out of North Africa, Carthage possessed immense wealth, a massive fleet, and an absolute monopoly on Mediterranean trade. They were a peer competitor. Every victory Rome won to secure its local territory directly escalated the scale of its foreign enemies. The rivalry exploded into the Punic Wars. The stakes shifted instantly from securing local farmlands to fighting for total dominion over the Mediterranean Sea. The Second Punic War brought the conflict to Rome's doorstep. The Carthaginian general Hannibal launched an audacious offensive, marching an army equipped with massive war elephants out of Spain and straight toward Italy. Hannibal drove his forces directly over the Alps. It was a geographic barrier considered impassable for an army of that size. Thousands of his soldiers froze or fell, but the surviving force broke through into northern Italy. This map tracks the devastation that followed. Hannibal routed the Roman legions in their own territory, pushing deep into the homeland and dismantling defensive lines that had stood for generations. The Republic lost tens of thousands of men, yet the Senate refused to negotiate. They drafted new citizens, they even armed slaves, and rebuilt shattered legions to sustain a war of attrition that finally exhausted Hannibal's forces. The military tactics of the Romans failed. They survived the Second Punic War simply because their civic institutions could absorb catastrophic losses and rebuild faster than the enemy could destroy them. Rome emerged from the Punic Wars without a rival. They were the undisputed masters of the Mediterranean. Victory brought a deluge of global trade, foreign tribute, and raw plunder. Wealth from foreign conquests bypassed the state treasury, pooling almost entirely with individual generals. As commanders amassed private fortunes, the lower classes faced economic ruin, pushed off their land. This extreme disparity paralyzed the government, corrupting the Senate with elite private wealth. The resources harvested to protect the Republic were actively destroying its social fabric. The political machinery of Rome was designed to govern a small agricultural city-state. It was physically incapable of managing a global empire. The institutions that held Rome together splintered under the pressure of concentrated wealth. The final break happened in the military. Roman soldiers, neglected by the state, realized their pay depended entirely on their commanding generals. Their loyalty shifted from the Republic to the men signing their checks. Command of an army now meant total political leverage. Ambitious generals turned their legions inward, toward Rome itself, a breakdown that culminated when Julius Caesar marched his forces across the Italian border. The Roman Republic succeeded in conquering the known world, but the spoils of that conquest created an internal contradiction it could not survive. By acquiring an empire, Rome forced. Look across the European continent today, and you will still find the roads and aqueducts engineered by the Roman Empire. For centuries, its armies held vast territories under a single system of laws that still shape modern governments. Yet, long before it spanned from Britain to the Middle East, Rome was a single, vulnerable settlement. It began in the 8th century BC as a scattering of small villages beside the Tiber River in central Italy. To explain their own survival, the Romans later adopted a powerful myth. They believed their city was founded in 753 BC by twin brothers, Romulus and Remus, abandoned as infants and kept alive by a nursing she-wolf. Positioned far enough inland to avoid pirate attacks, yet close enough to the sea for trade, the early Romans used the fertile farmland and river access to build a prosperous local economy. That localized wealth gave the citizens the leverage to overthrow their ruling kings in 509 BC. They established a system where authority was shared among elected officials and a senate, creating a republic that would eventually drive their expansion. The newly formed Roman Republic fought a series of wars against neighboring tribes across the Italian peninsula. Through strict military discipline and strategic alliances, they gradually absorbed their rivals and united Italy under their control. As they looked outward to the Mediterranean Sea, they found it already dominated by Carthage, a wealthy North African empire that controlled the region's trade. This rivalry erupted into the Punic Wars. During the second conflict, the Carthaginian general Hannibal executed a maneuver that shocked the ancient world, marching tens of thousands of soldiers and a contingent of war elephants directly over the Alps and into Italy. Hannibal inflicted devastating casualties, but the Romans refused to surrender. They absorbed the losses, rebuilt their decimated legions, and ultimately defeated Hannibal on his own continent. With Carthage neutralized, Rome became the dominant power of the Mediterranean. Trade, conquered land, and heavy tributes immediately began flooding into the Republic. But that influx of money created a fatal fracture. The new wealth disproportionately favored the military commanders and the political elite. As generals became richer than the state itself, the gap between rich and poor expanded, and the shared power structure of the Republic began to dissolve from within. The volume of new money shifted the loyalties of the Roman military. Soldiers realized their wages and retirement land were secured by their commanding generals rather than the distant Senate. Loyalty followed the men who could pay. The commander who maximized this broken system was Julius Caesar. By conquering the vast territory of Gaul, modern-day France and Belgium, Caesar amassed enormous personal wealth and secured the absolute devotion of his hardened legions. Back in Rome, a faction of senators watched his rise with alarm. They realized Caesar had the popularity and the military muscle to dismantle their authority entirely. In 49 BC, the Senate attempted to strip him of his command. In response, Caesar gathered his forces and marched them across the Rubicon River, violating Roman law by bringing an active army into Italy. Crossing the Rubicon was an open declaration of war. It ended the era of political compromise, forcing the state into a civil conflict to decide who would control the resources of Rome. Caesar swiftly defeated his political rivals on the battlefield. Returning to Rome as the victor, he bypassed the traditional limits of the Republic and had himself declared dictator for life. To stabilize the state, he implemented a program of reforms. He reorganized the government, reduced the debt burden on the citizenry, expanded citizenship, and updated the calendar, securing the loyalty of the common people. Yet his absolute control alienated his remaining enemies. A conspiracy grew among a group of senators who were convinced Caesar planned to crown himself king and permanently destroy Roman liberty. On March 15, 44 BC, they acted. As Caesar entered the Senate house, the conspirators surrounded him and assassinated him on the floor. The senators believed they had saved the Republic. Instead, the assassination triggered a final civil war, that ensured the republican system they fought for would never return. Out of the resulting power vacuum emerged Caesar's adopted son, Octavian. Over years of conflict, he eliminated his rivals, eventually defeating Mark Antony and Cleopatra to secure control over the Mediterranean. In 27 BC, Octavian took the title Augustus. This marked the transition from a failing republic to an autocratic Roman Empire, with Augustus as emperor. His reign launched the Pax Romana. For nearly 2 centuries, the interior enjoyed reliable stability. Trade flowed across borders, and a unified legal code spread throughout the provinces. Vast stone aqueducts carried fresh water over massive distances, allowing city populations to grow far beyond what local wells could support. To keep these urban populations placated, the state built enormous infrastructure. Giant amphitheaters hosted spectacular games to entertain millions of citizens living under imperial rule. Through heavy investment in public works and relative peace, early emperors managed to maintain the outward facade of the old republic while monopolizing absolute power. The empire reached its maximum territorial extent under Emperor Trajan, spanning from Britain to Mesopotamia and ruling 70 million people. But defending that perimeter was a logistical challenge, with the army spread across thousands of miles, struggling to hold back frequent incursions. Monuments from this period document the strain. Relief carvings show the constant state of war required to maintain the empire, detailing the endless troop movements and combat necessary to hold the frontier. At the same time, internal decay was affecting the government. Corruption spread through the bureaucracy, economic troubles mounted, and the military increasingly demanded political control. The empire appeared larger and more formidable than ever, but beneath the surface, the strain of managing such immense size and military cost was beginning to pull at the very foundations of Roman power. Modern democratic governments, contemporary legal systems, and Romance languages spanning the globe all share a common root. The physical and cultural residue of Rome is still embedded in modern society, yet this massive continent-spanning power began simply as a small collection of villages. It formed around a highly strategic crossing point on the Tiber River, offering fertile farmland and access to trade, while sitting safely inland from coastal raiders. In 509 BC, the inhabitants of this settlement expelled their monarchs. They created a system of government where elected officials and a senate shared decision-making authority, laying the framework for the Roman Republic. The city survived its vulnerable early years by relying on this structured governance. Consensus and shared responsibility allowed the Republic to slowly outlast rival Italian tribes and unify the peninsula. Rome soon met a rival capable of destroying it. During the Second Punic War, the Carthaginian general Hannibal moved an army, complete with war elephants, across the Alps and directly into Roman territory. Hannibal inflicted devastating casualties on Roman legions. Yet the Republic absorbed these losses, continually rebuilt its armies, and eventually wore down the Carthaginian forces. Defeating Carthage transformed Rome into the supreme power of the Mediterranean. Tribute, conquered land, and control over crucial trade routes funneled immense wealth back to the Italian mainland. This sudden influx of capital fractured the existing social order. Elite politicians and military leaders absorbed the new wealth, driving thousands of average farmers into poverty, while soldiers began swearing loyalty to their rich commanders rather than the state. The military triumph that guaranteed Rome's survival created the economic inequality that ultimately broke the Republic from within. One commander leveraged this new reality to maximum effect. Julius Caesar spent years conquering the region of Gaul, earning absolute devotion from his legions and overwhelming popularity among the common citizens. Fearing his immense influence, the Senate ordered Caesar to surrender his command. Instead, in 49 BC, he crossed the Rubicon River with his army, an act of open rebellion that ignited a vast civil war. Caesar dismantled his rivals and forced the Senate to name him dictator for life. He centralized power, reduced consumer debt, and expanded citizenship, angering the old elites while satisfying his base. On March 15, 44 BC, a faction of senators assassinated Caesar on the Senate floor. They reasoned that eliminating the dictator would automatically restore democratic norms. Instead, the assassination triggered a brutal power vacuum. A final, exhausting series of wars wiped out the remaining defenders of the Senate. By 27 BC, Caesar's adopted son, Octavian, had defeated all opposing factions. Taking the title Augustus, he consolidated absolute authority and became the first Roman emperor. Augustus established the Pax Romana. For 200 years, the Mediterranean basin experienced consistent political stability and highly integrated trade under a single system of law. State resources shifted toward monumental infrastructure. Massive aqueducts supplied expanding urban centers, while paved road networks accelerated commerce and communication across distant provinces. This map shows the empire expanding to its maximum territorial extent under Emperor Trajan. The borders stretched continuously from Britain in the northwest to Mesopotamia in the east, ruling over 70 million people. However, drawing a line around the known world created thousands of miles of exposed frontier. Defending this perimeter required a permanent, massively expensive standing army. The physical vastness of this massive territory demanded a complex logistical supply chain that the ancient economy could barely support. By the 3rd century AD, the military realized its own leverage. Decades of chaos followed, where generals rapidly assassinated sitting emperors to claim the throne for themselves. This chart illustrates the resulting economic collapse. To pay the increasingly demanding armies, the state debased its currency, triggering hyperinflation exactly as they increased the tax burden on ordinary citizens. While the internal economy faltered, external pressure mounted. Germanic groups like the Goths and Franks continuously probed and breached the underfunded frontier defenses. Seeking an administrative fix, Emperor Diocletian severed the massive territory in two, creating distinct western and eastern halves to make governance easier. Shortly after, Emperor Constantine built a heavily fortified new capital in the east, pulling the remaining wealth, trade, and political focus towards Constantinople. This geopolitical maneuver ensured the survival of the eastern territories, but it stripped the Western Empire of the critical resources required to defend itself. In 410 AD, the physical defenses of Italy failed. The Visigoths marched into Rome and sacked the city, shattering a psychological aura of invincibility that had stood for centuries. Decades of terminal decline followed. In 476 AD, the Germanic leader Odoacer quietly removed the final, powerless emperor from the throne, extinguishing the Western Roman Empire. The eastern half, the Byzantine Empire, maintained power. Protected by immense fortifications, it preserved Roman law and administration for nearly another 1,000 years. Long after the central government dissolved, the physical and cultural architecture of the Romans remained. Their approaches to engineering, military organization, and governance permanently shaped the societies that followed. Strict discipline and strategic organization built the ancient world's most successful state. But as the borders stretched and the economy fractured, the failure to adapt turned the mechanisms of its success into the instruments of its collapse.